Have you ever noticed how certain life changes are celebrated publicly, while the emotional consequences of those changes remain almost entirely unspoken? I am not referring to the legal process of divorce, or to questions of fault, or to who was right or wrong in a relationship. What I am interested in is what tends to happen psychologically after a long-term marriage ends, once the dust settles and the public narrative begins to fade. From the outside, the story usually looks simple and optimistic. There are posts about new beginnings, about freedom, about finally choosing oneself. There are visible signs of confidence and independence that suggest clarity and relief. If you only look at the surface, it appears as though a difficult chapter has been closed and a better one has begun. But when you observe this closely, especially over time, a different picture starts to emerge. You begin to notice that many people, despite different personalities and circumstances, move through remarkably similar emotional experiences after the marriage ends. The language changes in familiar ways, the behaviors shift in predictable patterns, and the same internal questions tend to resurface months or even years later. This repetition is not a coincidence, and it is not a moral failure. It has very little to do with whether the divorce was justified or necessary. It has far more to do with how the human mind responds to the loss of structure, identity, and long-term emotional attachment. This is not a story about blaming anyone for leaving a marriage. It is an examination of what often happens beneath the confidence, beneath the optimism, and beneath the narratives people adopt in order to move forward without falling apart. There is a psychological pattern that shows up again and again, quietly and consistently. And once you understand how that pattern works, many of the behaviors and emotions that follow divorce begin to make sense in a way they never did before. That is what we are going to examine here, not to judge the decision itself, but to understand the journey that tends to follow it. After a marriage ends, the first thing people often underestimate is how suddenly everyday life changes. It is not just the relationship that disappears, but the structure that quietly held everything together for years. The routines that once felt automatic are gone. There is no longer a shared morning rhythm, no familiar back and forth about plans, no small, predictable moments that used to shape the day without much thought. Even simple things, like who makes the coffee or how the evening usually ends, suddenly feel uncertain. The physical space changes too. Rooms feel larger or emptier than they used to. Personal belongings are moved, rearranged, or removed altogether, and the home no longer carries the same sense of shared meaning. Familiar places begin to feel unfamiliar, not because they look different, but because the emotional context has shifted. Emotionally, this period is confusing because opposite feelings often exist at the same time. There can be real relief, especially if the marriage was difficult or emotionally draining. There can also be excitement about the possibility of something new. But alongside that relief and excitement, there is often fear, grief, and a quiet sense of loss that is harder to explain. This emotional contradiction is important because the human brain does not like uncertainty. When something familiar disappears, the mind immediately starts searching for a way to make sense of what happened. It wants a clear story that explains the pain, justifies the change, and provides reassurance that everything will be okay. This is not a conscious process for most people. It is a psychological response to instability. When the structure of life changes suddenly, the mind moves quickly to create meaning, not because the meaning is fully true yet, but because having a story feels safer than sitting with unanswered questions. This is the moment where the emotional journey truly begins, long before anyone else can see it from the outside. When a major part of life ends, the mind does not stay in confusion for long. It starts building a story that makes the situation feel understandable and manageable. This story is not created to impress others or to avoid responsibility. It is created to help a person function when their sense of stability has been shaken. After divorce, the most common story the mind reaches for is one of empowerment. The change is framed as necessary, brave, and overdue. The focus shifts toward growth, independence, and self-discovery. This framing brings relief because it turns loss into purpose and uncertainty into direction. This narrative does not develop in isolation. Friends often encourage it because they want to be supportive and reassuring. Popular culture reinforces it through language about new chapters and personal freedom. Social media amplifies it even further by rewarding confident expressions of independence with attention and approval. That validation plays an important psychological role. It helps quiet the fear that comes with starting over. It reassures the mind that the decision was not only acceptable, but admirable. Each compliment, each supportive message, and each sign of approval strengthens the story and makes it feel more solid. Over time, the narrative becomes easier to repeat and harder to question. What began as a coping mechanism slowly starts to feel like an identity. The line between healing and performance becomes less clear, because expressing confidence and independence also brings reassurance from others. This is where things become complicated. The story helps someone move forward, but it does not always reflect the full emotional reality underneath. Survival and truth are not always the same thing, especially in the early stages of loss. Understanding this does not mean the story is false or dishonest. It simply means it serves a psychological purpose first. And recognizing that purpose helps explain why so many people sound similar during this stage, even when their lives and marriages were very different. After the initial shock begins to settle and the new story takes shape, many people enter what can be described as the first phase of the emotional journey. This phase is often marked by a strong sense of liberation and renewed energy. Life starts to feel open in a way it has not for a long time. Daily routines are no longer tied to another person's preferences or schedule, and that freedom can feel refreshing. Small changes begin to appear, such as updating personal style, rearranging living spaces, or picking up interests that were once postponed or ignored. Social life often becomes more active during this time. Friends reach out more frequently, invitations increase, and there is a general sense of being supported and encouraged. These interactions create momentum and help fill the space left by the relationship, making the transition feel less lonely. Attention also changes during this phase, and for many people, it returns in a noticeable way. Being seen as an individual again, rather than as part of a couple, can feel validating and affirming. Compliments come more easily, interest feels more visible, and the sense of being noticed can boost confidence quickly. This validation can be especially powerful because it arrives during a moment of emotional vulnerability. The brain responds strongly to novelty, attention, and positive feedback, releasing chemicals that create excitement and motivation. The result is a genuine emotional high that makes life feel lighter and more promising. During this phase, the optimism feels real because it is real. The energy, confidence, and excitement are not imagined or exaggerated. They are natural responses to change, freedom, and renewed stimulation. At this stage, there is little reason to question the experience, because everything seems to confirm that life is moving in the right direction. This is why Phase 1 often feels convincing and complete on its own. It provides relief, momentum, and hope, which makes it easy to believe that the hardest part is already over. As the excitement of this new phase continues, something subtle begins to change beneath the surface. The confidence that once felt internal starts to rely more heavily on external responses. In a long-term relationship, validation is often quiet and steady. It shows up in familiarity, in being understood without explanation, and in knowing that someone sees you even when no one else is watching. After that kind of validation disappears, the desire for reassurance does not go away. In many cases, it becomes stronger. During this phase, approval comes from many directions at once. Friends express encouragement, social media responds quickly to visible confidence, and new interactions provide frequent affirmation. This kind of validation feels powerful because it is immediate and abundant, especially compared to the emotional uncertainty that came before it. Over time, however, this approval begins to influence choices in small but noticeable ways. People start paying more attention to what gets the best reaction and less attention to what feels genuinely fulfilling. Clothing choices, social activities, and even personal goals slowly begin to revolve around external responses rather than internal satisfaction. This shift does not happen intentionally, and it is not driven by insecurity in the way people often assume. It happens because the brain learns quickly. It notices what brings reassurance and relief, and it starts reaching for those sources more often. The problem is that this type of validation requires constant reinforcement. It does not settle into the background the way deep connection does. It needs to be refreshed, maintained, and repeated, which introduces a level of pressure that is easy to ignore at first. This is the point where the energy that once felt effortless begins to require more effort to sustain. The change is quiet, but it sets the foundation for the emotional fatigue that tends to appear later on. After the initial excitement fades, many people begin to notice that the emotional momentum they were riding no longer feels as strong as it once did. Life does not feel bad, but it no longer feels new in the same way, and that difference can be confusing. Dating, which once felt exciting and full of possibility, often starts to feel repetitive. The conversations begin to sound familiar, and the questions tend to follow the same patterns. Over time, it becomes harder to feel genuinely curious, even when the person across the table is kind or attractive. Social activities also start to lose some of their energy. Nights out, group gatherings, and regular meetups no longer provide the same sense of escape or excitement they once did. What initially felt like freedom slowly begins to feel like another routine. During this phase, many people realize that being wanted is not the same as being understood. Attention and interest can feel good in the moment, but they do not always lead to meaningful connection. The difference between surface-level interest and deeper understanding becomes more noticeable as time goes on. This realization does not arrive all at once. It shows up gradually in small moments of boredom, distraction, or emotional distance. There may be more silence after conversations end and less anticipation for the next interaction. This is often the point where people start quietly comparing their current experiences to their past. They may not be longing for the relationship itself, but they begin to notice what is missing. The emotional weight of those comparisons adds gravity to the experience and signals that the journey is moving into a more reflective stage. As the plateau settles in, a deeper and more personal question often begins to surface. It is not about dating or social life anymore, but about identity. For a long time, being part of a relationship shaped how many people saw themselves. Decisions were made with someone else in mind, and daily life carried a shared sense of direction. Even when the relationship was imperfect, it provided a role and a sense of belonging that became familiar over time. When that role disappears, the freedom that once felt empowering can begin to feel unanchored. There is no one to check in with, no shared point of reference, and no clear sense of being needed in someone else's daily life. What once sounded like independence slowly starts to resemble isolation. This realization often arrives in ordinary moments rather than dramatic ones. It might happen at the end of a long day, during a quiet evening, or in the space between plans. There is no crisis, just a lingering sense that something important is missing. Self-discovery, which once felt exciting, now carries pressure. Finding meaning and direction becomes urgent instead of enjoyable. There is a growing awareness that personal freedom alone does not automatically create fulfillment. This is a difficult stage because it forces people to confront themselves without distraction. There is no partner to reflect identity back to them, and no shared story to lean on. What remains is a quieter question about who they are and what actually gives their life meaning. This realization is uncomfortable, but it also deepens the emotional experience. It is often the moment when the journey stops feeling social and starts feeling personal. After months or even years of navigating life alone, many people reach a point where the excitement and novelty begin to fade completely. This is the reckoning phase, when the full weight of the changes starts to settle in. Dating, which once felt full of possibility, now often feels exhausting. Conversations repeat themselves, first dates lose their charm, and the hope of finding someone who truly understands feels more distant than it once did. What initially felt like freedom can start to feel like effort without reward. Financial realities also become more apparent. The independence that was thrilling at first can now feel expensive and complicated. Budgets tighten, choices become constrained, and the lifestyle once enjoyed as part of a couple can no longer be maintained in the same way. These pressures add a quiet but persistent strain that affects both daily life and emotional well-being. Emotional exhaustion begins to set in as well. The constant need for social interaction, validation, and self-reinvention takes its toll. Nights that once felt exciting now feel lonely, and the energy that once fueled enthusiasm is replaced with fatigue. During this phase, memory also plays trick. The mind begins to soften past experiences, remembering the comfort, laughter, and shared understanding of the old relationship while downplaying the reasons for leaving. The past starts to look rosier than it felt in the moment, and comparisons become inevitable. This is when the reality of choices collides with human expectation. The independence and freedom that were celebrated earlier are no longer enough on their own, and the mind quietly asks questions about what was gained and what might have been lost. This is the reckoning phase. It is heavy, quiet, and unavoidable. It forces reflection and invites understanding, but it can also make the journey feel more complicated than it ever seemed at the start. As time passes, many people find themselves caught in a quiet, almost invisible cycle of comparison. It does not happen in big, dramatic moments, but in small, persistent thoughts that quietly shape feelings and decisions. The stability and familiarity of the past often begin to look more appealing than it did at the time. People remember the comfort of routines, the shared jokes, and the way life felt predictable and safe. Even if the relationship had problems, those moments of ease and connection are highlighted in memory, while the frustrations and conflicts fade into the background. At the same time, the freedom they once celebrated begins to feel less certain. Autonomy and independence are rewarding, but they also come with responsibility, loneliness, and the weight of making all choices alone. The sense of freedom starts to feel like uncertainty. Attention from others can also feel hollow compared to genuine belonging. Being noticed or admired is satisfying for a moment, but it does not replace the deep understanding and connection that came from a long-term partnership. The contrast becomes more apparent over time, and it can be unsettling. These comparisons are rarely loud or deliberate. They appear as quiet questions in the mind. Did I make the right choice? Am I really happier now? What am I missing? They linger under the surface, creating a subtle but persistent tension that makes even ordinary moments feel heavier than before. This is the phase where the journey starts to feel emotionally complex. The mind is not just observing life. It is measuring it against what came before, and the weight of that comparison can feel overwhelming without the person even realizing it. Eventually, most people reach a point where the emotional journey begins to stabilize. The intensity of earlier phases fades, and life starts to feel more manageable. This is the phase where people find a way to cope with the new reality, even if it is not exactly what they imagined. People tend to settle into one of three general patterns. Some embrace radical independence. They focus entirely on themselves, their careers, their hobbies, and their social circles. They find meaning in self-reliance and make peace with being alone, turning autonomy into a source of identity and pride. Others find themselves in compromised relationship. After experiencing the challenges of dating, loneliness, and comparison, they may lower their expectations slightly to find companionship. These relationships may not reflect everything they wanted at the beginning, but they provide connection, routine, and a sense of belonging. A third group revisits the past in some way. They may reconnect with an ex, reflect on what was lost, or find themselves reevaluating choices they made early on. This does not necessarily lead to reconciliation, but it is often part of processing the emotional weight of what happened. None of these paths are framed as success or failure. They are coping mechanisms, ways of adapting to a life that has changed dramatically. Each outcome reflects how the mind and heart respond to loss, freedom, and the passage of time. By this phase, the pattern that began with excitement and freedom comes full circle. The highs, the doubts, the comparisons, and the emotional fatigue all contribute to a deeper understanding of oneself and one's need. The journey may not be perfect, but it is complete, and the lessons from each phase linger long after the novelty fades. The truth is that divorce is not the villain in this story. It is a change in circumstances, a shift in daily life, and sometimes a necessary step for growth. But no external change automatically transforms who we are on the inside. Real transformation comes from confronting ourselves honestly, from asking difficult questions about our choices, our patterns, and the ways we respond to both freedom and loss. That work is uncomfortable, and it cannot be outsourced to a new relationship, a social circle, or a temporary high of attention. The emotional journey we've explored, the euphoria, the plateau, the reckoning, and the settling, reveals one important lesson. Growth is not found in rearranging the furniture of life. It is found in the quiet, often challenging work of understanding ourselves and learning to navigate our own minds and hearts with awareness. In the end, the pattern is not about failure. It is about the human tendency to repeat familiar emotional cycles until we learn from them. The people who emerge truly changed are not those who left or gained something external, but those who faced themselves patiently and allowed real self-awareness to take root. Divorce may open a door, but walking through it and building a life that feels whole is a choice, and a responsibility that only comes from within.